Hey, this is Navinad. I want to go back over continuation betting. Seems like there's been a little bit of an influx in some of the people that I coach, some of my poker students, asking questions about proper continuation betting. So I'm going to start out with kind of explaining what c betting is and why it is, and just kind of asking the questions: why do we c bet in the first place? And really, does it make sense from a game theory optimal perspective, or from a real standpoint of live in-game, the mathematics behind it? Does it make sense for pre-flop raiser to tend to bet the flop when he raises pre-flop and gets called? And the other end of that is, does it make sense for pre-flop caller to generally check to the pre-flop raiser? And they're fair questions. Now here are the dynamics at play that dictate the why we see that. These are the dynamics that give us the reasons for checking to the raiser as pre-flop caller and betting, continuation betting as pre-flop raiser. Pre-flop raiser's range could be defined as a wider range. It's going to be an uncapped range, and it's going to be basically unbound, and it's going to be more polarized than pre-flop caller's range. So relatively, PFR's range will be wide. What do I mean by wide? There's going to be more hands in it. There's going to be bluffs and there's going to be value hands, but there's not going to be as many kind of really strong hands in pre-flop caller's range, but there's also not going to be as many weak hands in pre-flop caller's range. Pre-flop caller's range is narrow, it's capped, it's bound, and it's more merged, less polarized. So by wide, we just mean there's more hands. Pre-flop raiser, if he's raising in a single raise pot, or if he's the 3-better or the 4-better, his range is going to have bluffs and value hands. But pre-flop caller's got a more narrow range because he's not going to have nutted value hands. He's not going to have pocket aces very often because he would re-raise with those, and he's not going to have bluffs because he didn't raise. He just called, so he's clearly not bluffing. So he's going to have more of a narrowly defined range. He's not going to have the stuff that's on the outer ends. He's going to have more of the middling stuff. So pre-flop raiser has an uncapped range. He's going to have pocket kings, pocket aces, pocket queens still in his range, where pre-flop caller's range is going to tend to be capped when he's typically going to be expected to 3-bet or 4-bet with hands like aces and kings, and 3-bet like ace-king suited and ace-king, maybe pocket jacks, pocket queens. So his range is going to be capped. He can only have such a strong hand. He's not going to tend to have the nutted value hands. The PFR's range will be pretty much unbound, meaning he can have crap, he can have garbage, but PF caller's range is going to be bound at whatever the weakest hand he's willing to call for value with. So you're going to have a more polarized distribution in pre-flop raiser's range. He's going to have bluffs and he's going to have value hands. He's going to be raising or re-raising to get called by second best hands or to fold out better hands. So he's not going to be likely to, let's say in a full ring situation, if the cutoff seat opens, late position open, and there's a guy on the button who 3-bets, he re-raises. He's probably not doing that with a hand like king queen, because he's not going to be expecting a whole lot of hands that are worse than king queen to call a re-raise, or better than king queen to fold to a re-raise. So he'd probably flat with that hand. So if pre-flop, let's say pre-flop, we go to a middle position open raises, and late position just flat calls. Now he does have things like queen jack suited, and things like king queen offsuit, ace 10 suited, hands that would not be expected to be in his range had he 3-bet, because we're 3-betting for value, we're 3-betting as a bluff, but we're trying not to 3-bet those hands that are just not going to be called by second best hands and not going to cause better hands to fold. So these are the dynamics and the differences between how we look at and view PFR's range compared to PFC's range. So what's the effect when we go to the flop? The effect is that pre-flop raiser's range is going to be wide enough that he's going to be able to rep a value hand on just about any flop. He's going to have sets, he's going to have overpairs, he's going to have a lot of valuable hands on just about any flop. If the flop comes off 10 Jack Queen, he can have Ace King. If the flop comes out very raggedy, discombobulated, like a 7-4-2 rainbow, he can still have the big overpairs where we wouldn't expect pre-flop caller to have those. So pre-flop raiser is going to have more value hands, but he's also, because his range is wider, he's got more hands in his range, sort of by definition of having a wider range, they're also going to miss more flops. Pre-flop raiser is going to flop more air, and he's going to flop more like big value hands like top pair, top kicker, and over pairs, and he's going to have less mediocre hands like middle pair. He's going to have less mediocre hands like, say 9-7 suited that flops like a weak 9-out flush draw. If he flops a flush draw, it's going to tend to be like a nut flush draw with overcards. Where pre-flop caller's range is going to basically fall into the categories speculative hands and mediocre hands. So he's going to probably flat with a lot of stuff like double suited broadways, like even offsuit broadways like King Queen, King Jack. He'll have some King 10 suited type hands, and he's going to have speculative hands like small pairs. He's going to have mediocre hands like the double broadways again, and the bigger suited connectors. Like Jack 10 suited, and he's going to have 10-9 suited hands like that, and also like pocket 8s, pocket 7s that could fall into speculative hand or mediocre hands. So the speculative hands like suited Ace X and your suited connectors and small pairs are going to either hit hard or miss completely most of the time, or they're going to flop big draws. The mediocre hands like your King 10s, your King Jacks, and your Queen 10 suiteds, your Jack 10 suiteds are going to flop a lot of draws, and they're going to flop a lot of like top pair with weak kicker that are vulnerable to overcards and overpairs, and they're going to flop a lot of like top pair with a weak kicker, second pair with a decent kicker type, mediocre bluff catcher type hands. So they're going to flop medium strength hands sort of by the definition of having a mediocre strength range, or they're going to be the type of hand that really hits hard. Either they're going to flop a set with their pocket 6s, or they're going to just have like an underpair to 3 overcards with their pocket 6s. So they're going to have spec hands that hit or miss, and they're going to have mediocre hands that flop a lot of tight, like draw type hands, and mediocre value hands like bluff catchers, showdown value. So what does this mean? It means that pre-flop raiser flopping a lot of value hands and a lot of air, like missing completely, and flopping big, it's going to give him more incentive to bet on more flops. That's because when he has air, he's going to want to bet as a bluff. He's going to have a lot of incentive to bet in order to get better hands to fold, and because his range is wider, he's going to be able to represent a bigger hand on more flops, and also his range is uncapped, so he can still have aces, he can still have kings, so he can represent a big hand on just about any flop. He's also going to actually hit some flops or start with some big pairs that are going to want to bet for value. So a lot of his range, most of his range on most flops, is going to have incentive to either bet as a bluff or bet for value. Now, because pre-flop caller is going to have more mediocre hands and draws, he's probably not going to have as much reason to bet as many flops. He's going to have more incentive to check back and try to get his like second pair to showdown, or his top pair with a weak kicker to the next street where he can start, bluff catching, inducing bluffs and bluff catching, or start to value bet a little bit thin if, say, it does go like check, 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 and he can then, if he's in position, make a value bet with like top pair weak kicker or second pair with a good kicker and maybe go for 1 or 2 streets of value. But mainly the reason that pre-flop caller wants to check to the pre-flop raiser is simply because pre-flop caller can expect pre-flop raiser to bet a very high percent of the time. If we knew for a fact that pre-flop raiser was going to continuation bet the flop, we would have practically no incentive to bet ever as pre-flop caller. What part of our range would it make sense to bet as pre-flop caller if we know pre-flop raiser is going to continuation bet? If we flop something like second pair, Do we want to lead into pre-flop raiser if we know he's going to bet his entire range? Well, probably not, because if we bet something like second pair, now if pre-flop raiser had the bluff part, the air part of his range, he can just fold it, and we don't get to collect that continuation bet bluff. So if we have something like second pair, some kind of mediocre hand, our hand is going to play better by checking and letting pre-flop raiser bluff and checking and calling. Also, if pre-flop raiser does have a big hand, we don't want to lead second pair into a big hand either and then get raised. Now, what if we flop a very nutted value hand, like a set, with pre-flop caller's range? If we know that pre-flop raiser is always going to c-bet, and that's taking it to the extreme, but just for instance, if pre-flop raiser c-bets nearly 100% of the time, it would not make sense for us to bet or lead out with a set of sixes when we can check, let villain put in his continuation bet, and then we can decide to either check raise there or check and call and maybe go for a check raise on a later street. So we're not going to want to lead with our mediocre hands, our medium strength hands. They're going to play better as bluff catchers. We're not going to want to lead with our nutted value hands. They're going to play better as traps, check raises or check calls. So what about our draws? Well, basically, we have the option to check and call with a draw. We have the option to check and raise with a draw. So we really don't ever need to lead with our draws. Now, it wouldn't be terrible to lead with our draws, but it's going to be playing pretty face up, and it's going to be hard to balance if we're only ever leading as a bluff or a semi-bluff. If we're always checking our mediocre made hands and we're always checking our nutted value hands, then it's not going to take a rocket scientist to know that every time we lead, we don't have a made hand. And that's very exploitable. So since we're checking with our bluff catchers and we're checking with our value hands, we can't only lead with our bluffs, or we're going to be very exploitable, and it's not going to take much to exploit us. Our opponent could essentially just raise us every time we lead into him if we're always bluffing when we lead, or he can just play very correctly against our range, basically, if we section it off and split it so strictly and so completely. So this is just kind of I guess, conceptual framework. This is the idea behind continuation betting, and I'm going to do another video, maybe two more videos, that go into actual situations where we're choosing to either c-bet or not c-bet as pre-flop raiser, and we're looking at how to deal with those c-bets as pre-flop caller in-game. Until next time, Navanad. Over and out.